Imagine walking into a crowded bar on a Friday night. Music is playing, people are laughing, and friends are celebrating the start of spring break. For most people, it's a completely ordinary night, one they'll barely remember a few weeks later. But for one young medical student, that night would become the beginning of a mystery that remains unsolved nearly 20 years later. His name was Brian Shaffer. He was 27 years old and had plans for the future. He was studying medicine, had a girlfriend, a family, friends, and a vacation scheduled just days away. Yet sometime during the early morning hours of April 1st, 2006, Brian disappeared. No confirmed sightings, no known financial activity, no answers, just questions. Questions that investigators have been trying to answer for nearly 2 decades. Questions that continue to generate debate among detectives, journalists, and true crime researchers. What happened after Brian's final confirmed sighting? Did he leave voluntarily? Was he the victim of foul play? Was there an accident? Or is the truth something no one has considered? Tonight we're examining one of the most puzzling missing persons cases in modern American history, the disappearance of Brian Shaffer. Welcome to Post Mortem. Was being stored in his basement, and that his killing tools were acquired through mail order outfits. In 1991, the search warrant executed by VPD revealed Allen had, in his basement, handwritten diagrams for bombs comprised of ammonium nitrate, fertilizer, and gravel. Also found were mail order catalogs for bombs, guns, and booby traps. On August 28th of 1992, video have never been revealed. Join me back in part 3 as we discuss a few more of the suspects in this infamous case. And until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and stay vigilant. Welcome back to Post Mortem. First, thank you for joining me for the beginning of Season 2. Whether you've been listening since the beginning or if you just discovered the show, I appreciate you spending part of your day here. This season will continue to examine both solved and unsolved cases, focusing on the evidence, the investigations, and the questions that remain long after the headlines disappear. And we're beginning with the case that has fascinated people for nearly 20 years, the disappearance of Brian Shaffer. Before we begin, a quick reminder. The information discussed in this episode comes from publicly available reporting, investigative summaries, and law enforcement statements. Any theories discussed are presented as theories, not facts. Unless otherwise stated, individuals mentioned in this episode have not been charged with any crime related to Brian Shaffer's disappearance. This episode contains discussions involving grief, missing persons, and death. Listener discretion is advised. Let's begin. One of the things I always try to do when covering a case is spend time talking about the person at the center of the story. Because it's easy to become focused on the mystery, the timeline, theories, and the evidence. But before Brian Shaffer became a missing person, he was simply Brian, a son, brother, boyfriend, a friend, and someone working towards a career that would have allowed him to help others. Brian Randall Shaffer was born on February 11th, 1979. He grew up in Pickering, Ohio, a suburb located east of Columbus. By all accounts, he was intelligent, charismatic, and social. The kind of person who would strike up a conversation with almost anyone. Friends often described him as outgoing, confident, and funny. Someone who enjoyed being around people. By 2006, Brian was attending Ohio State University College of Medicine. As most people know, medical school isn't easy. Anyone who has gone through it or knows someone who has understands the enormous commitment involved. The workload is demanding, the hours are long, and the pressure can be intense. Yet Brian was progressing through. At 27 years old, he appeared to be building a promising future. Looking back now, that's one of the details many people continue to focus on. Because when investigators examine missing persons cases, they often ask a simple question. What did this person's future look like? Were they making plans? Were they preparing for something? Did they appear engaged in life? And in Brian's case, many of those answered questions were yes. But there was another side to the story, one that often gets overlooked. Because in the weeks leading up to his disappearance, Brian experienced a devastating loss. Just weeks before Brian disappeared, his mother, Renee Shaffer, passed away after battling cancer. Anyone who has lost a parent understands how life-changing that experience can be. Grief doesn't follow a schedule. It doesn't move in a straight line, and it affects everyone differently. But for Brian, the loss came during an already demanding part of life. He was balancing medical school, relationships, future plans, and now the death of his mother. Family members later indicated that Brian was struggling with the loss, which would be completely understandable. At this point, it's important to avoid assumptions, because over the years, some people have pointed to Brian's grief as evidence supporting various theories, but grief alone doesn't explain a disappearance. Millions of people endure devastating losses without vanishing. Still, investigators would naturally consider it as part of the overall picture. When someone disappears unexpectedly, detectives look at everything: major life events, financial pressures, relationship issues, career concerns, health problems, anything that might provide context. The death of Brian's mother was one of the most significant events in his life at that time. Whether it had any connection to what happened to him remains unknown, but it would become part of this conversation surrounding the case, and the conversation continues today. One reason many people struggle with the idea that Brian intentionally disappeared is that he seemed to have plans. Not vague plans, specific plans. He was dating Alexis Wagner, and according to the reports at the time, the two were preparing to leave for a vacation in Miami. The trip was only days away. Now, future plans doesn't automatically eliminate the possibility that someone might choose to leave their life. People are complicated. Human behavior is complicated. But investigators often pay close attention to future commitments, vacations, job interviews, family events, school obligations. These things can provide clues about a person's mindset, and in Brian's case, there didn't appear to be obvious signs that he intended to abandon those plans. As investigators later examined his life, they found no publicly known evidence suggesting he had emptied bank accounts, no indication he had sold possessions, no evidence of preparations for a secret new life. Again, that's not proof of anything. But it's one of the reasons the case remains so difficult to explain. Because when detectives looked at Brian's circumstances, they didn't find a clear explanation for why he would vanish. Instead, they found uncertainty. And uncertainty is often where mystery begins. There are thousands of missing persons cases across North America. Many never receive national coverage. Many remain largely unknown outside the communities where they occur. So why did Brian Shaffer's disappearance become different? Part of the answer lies in the timing. Part of it lies in technology, and part of it lies in the circumstances surrounding the case itself. Because investigators weren't dealing with a person who disappeared from a remote hiking trail, a rural road, or from an isolated location. Brian disappeared from one of the busiest parts of Columbus, near businesses, near other people, near surveillance cameras, and that's what immediately captured attention. People expect cameras to provide answers. We assume surveillance footage can tell us exactly what happened. We assume modern technology makes it impossible for someone to simply vanish. But as we'll see later in this episode, the reality isn't always that simple. In fact, one of the reasons Brian's disappearance continues to fascinate people nearly 20 years later is that the evidence appears so close to providing an answer, and yet somehow falls so short. The result is a mystery that feels solvable, a mystery that feels like it should have been solved years ago. And perhaps that's why people continue to discuss it today. Because it feels like the answer is just out of reach. A missing piece, a missing witness, a missing moment, something that, if discovered, might finally explain what happened. But before we examine the investigation, we need to walk through Brian's final known night. Because unlike many missing person cases, investigators were able to reconstruct much of the timeline, at least up to a certain point. And it's that timeline that transforms this case from a disappearance into a mystery. Let's follow Brian's movements on March 31st, 2006, from dinner with his father through the final confirmed sighting that continues to puzzle investigators today. By the time investigators began reconstructing Brian's final known movements, they quickly realized something unusual. Unlike many missing persons cases, they weren't starting with a blank slate. They had witnesses, they had surveillance footage, they had phone records, and they had a relatively detailed timeline, at least for part of the night. What they didn't have was an explanation for what happened after the timeline ended, and that's where the mystery begins. March 31st marked the beginning of spring break for many Ohio State students. For Brian, it was a chance to relax and spend time with friends before an upcoming trip to Miami. Nothing about the day seemed unusual. No one reported strange behavior, no one reported an argument, no one reported a crisis. If you had crossed paths with Brian that afternoon, you likely would have seen a young medical student looking forward to a night out. And that's exactly how the evening began. One of the last confirmed people to see Brian before he met up with friends was his father, Randy Shaffer. The two shared dinner earlier that evening. When I first learned about this detail, it stayed with me for a reason that was nothing to do with the investigation. It's a reminder of how ordinary this night seemed, a father and son having dinner. It's something countless families do every day. Neither of them could have known that this would become their final known interaction. There was no indication that anything was wrong, no public reports of an argument, no suggestions that Brian was upset, no indication that Randy left the dinner concerned about his son. Instead, it appeared to be a normal evening, the kind of evening that becomes extraordinary only in hindsight. And unfortunately, hindsight is something that Case has plenty of. After dinner, Brian met with his friend Clint Florence. The pair planned to celebrate the start of spring break. As the evening progressed, they spent time visiting bars around Columbus. Eventually, they were joined by another friend, Meredith Reed. Together, the group continued socializing throughout the night. Now, one thing that's worth mentioning here is alcohol. Reports indicate Brian had been drinking during the evening, and that's not unusual. Many people were out celebrating spring break, but it is something investigators had to consider. Alcohol can affect judgment, it can affect memory, and it can increase vulnerability. And because investigators never determined what happened after Brian's final confirmed sighting, they had to evaluate whether alcohol may have played any role in the events that followed. Again, that's not evidence of anything, it's simply part of the context, and context matters, especially in missing persons cases. At some point during the night, the group arrived at the Ugly Tuna Saloon. For listeners unfamiliar with the case, the name has become almost as famous as the disappearance itself. The bar was located within the South Campus Gateway complex in Columbus, and understanding that location is important, because the layout of the building would later become one of the most heavily discussed aspects of the investigation. Unlike a standalone bar with a single front entrance, the Ugly Tuna occupied space within a larger commercial structure. Most patrons accessed it by taking an escalator to an upper-level entrance area. This detail might not seem important now, but keep it in mind, because later, when investigators reviewed surveillance footage, the design of the building would have become a critical factor. At the time, though, it was simply another stop during a night out. Brian entered the area with his friends, nothing appeared unusual, and no witnesses reported anything alarming. No one believed they were witnessing the beginning of a missing persons case. One of the frustrating realities of this case is that we don't have a minute-by-minute account of everything Brian did inside that bar. And honestly, that's not unusual. Most people don't document every conversation they've had during the night out. What investigators were able to establish is that Brian remained at the Ugly Tuna for several hours. Friends recalled spending time with him, witnesses placed him there, and surveillance footage helped establish portions of the timeline. For much of the evening, there appears to be nothing remarkable about his behavior. That's one reason this case continues to generate so much debate. Many disappearances are preceded by warning signs, a crisis, a conflict, a sudden change in behavior, something that investigators can point to and say, hey, that may be important. But in Brian's case, there doesn't appear to be any obvious moment like that, at least not one that investigators have publicly identified. As the night approached its end, surveillance cameras captured what would become one of the most analyzed moments in the entire case. Around 1:55 a.m., Brian was seen outside the bar speaking with two women. If you've ever watched the footage, the interaction appears ordinary. There's no visible argument, no distress, no indication that anything unusual is about to happen, just a conversation. The women were later identified and interviewed by investigators. Public reporting indicates they cooperated with law enforcement and were not considered suspects. That's important to mention because online discussions sometimes focus heavily on this interaction. But based on available information, investigators did not appear to believe these women were connected to Brian's disappearance. The significance of the footage lies elsewhere. Not in who Brian was speaking with, but in what happens afterwards. Or perhaps, more accurately, what doesn't happen afterward. Because after this conversation, Brian is seen moving back towards the entrance area, and this is where the confirmed timeline ends. Not the suspected timeline, not the estimated timeline, the confirmed timeline. The last moment investigators can place Brian Shaffer with certainty. Think about that for a second. A 27-year-old medical student is standing in a crowded entertainment district. People are everywhere. Businesses are open, security cameras are operating, and yet, this becomes the final confirmed sighting. That's one of the reasons this case has remained so compelling. The disappearance doesn't occur in isolation. It occurs in a place where answers should exist, and somehow they don't. Eventually, the Ugly Tuna Saloona closed for the night. Patrons began leaving, the crowd dispersed, people headed home, others moved on to after parties and late night restaurants. It was the normal end to a busy Friday night. But as Clint and Meredith prepared to leave, they couldn't find Brian. Initially, that wasn't necessarily cause for alarm. Anyone who spends time in a crowded bar district knows how easily friends can become separated. It happens all the time. A person leaves early, the other heads to a different location, someone forgets to tell the group they're leaving, and in the moment, it probably seemed entirely possible that Brian had simply gone home. And honestly, that's likely what people would have assumed. But over the next several hours, the assumption would begin to unravel. Calls to Brian went unanswered, time passed, and concern slowly began to grow. Again, by itself, this isn't necessarily unusual. People sleep through calls, phones die, late nights lead to late mornings, but then came a much more troubling development. Brian failed to show up for his planned trip to Miami. For those closest to him, this was a major red flag. This wasn't someone missing a casual get-together. This was a planned vacation, one he had reportedly been looking forward to, one that required preparation, one that involved other people expecting him to arrive, and he simply never appeared. At that point, concern transformed into something much more serious, because now family and friends weren't asking where Brian had gone after the bar. They were asking whether something had happened to him, and as investigators would soon discover, answering the question would be far more difficult than anyone expected. At first, detectives likely believed the surveillance footage would provide answers. After all, they knew where Brian had spent the evening, they knew when he was last seen, and they had cameras covering portions of the area. It seemed reasonable to assume the footage would reveal what happened next. Instead, it would create one of the most puzzling mysteries in modern true crime. When investigators reviewed the footage, they found something they never expected. A man is entering the area. A man is spending time with his friends. A man was seen shortly before closing, and then nothing. So let's take a look at the investigation itself. When Brian was officially reported missing, investigators weren't starting with nothing. In many missing person cases, detectives spend the first several days simply trying to answer basic questions. Where was the person last seen? Who were they with? What were they doing? What was their state of mind? But in Brian's case, investigators already had all of those answers. Or at least that's what they thought. They knew where Brian had spent the evening. They knew who he had been with. They knew roughly where he had been seen last. And perhaps most importantly, they knew surveillance footage existed. From an investigative standpoint, that sounds promising, because cameras don't forget, they don't misremember details, they don't change their stories. Or at least that's what most people assume. But as detectives would soon discover, cameras don't always provide answers. Sometimes they simply create new questions. One of the first priorities was collecting and reviewing surveillance footage from the South Campus Gateway complex. Investigators expected to confirm Brian's movements and identify when he left the area. It seemed straightforward. Brian had entered the bar district. Surely there would be footage showing him leaving. But when detectives reviewed the recordings, they encountered a problem. They could clearly see Brian entering the area. They could identify portions of his movements throughout the evening, and they could see him talking with the two women at 1:55 a.m. What they could not find was definitive footage showing him leaving through the primary monitored route. And that's the detail that transformed a missing person case into a national mystery. Now, this is a good place to address one of the most common misconceptions about the case. You've probably heard people say, Brian was seen entering the bar, but never leaving. That statement isn't entirely wrong, but it can sometimes create a misleading picture, because it implies the investigators had cameras covering every possible exit, and that's not exactly the case. The reality is more complicated, and understanding that reality is critical. One reason this case remains so debated is that many people imagine the surveillance system as a modern, comprehensive network with complete coverage. But this was 2006. Technology was different, camera placement was different, storage capabilities were different, and most businesses weren't operating with the level of surveillance coverage people expect today. The footage available to investigators covered important portions of the entrance area, but it did not necessarily provide complete visibility of every possible route someone could take. That distinction matters, because while investigators couldn't confirm Brian leaving through the primary route, They also couldn't completely eliminate every alternative possibility. And that's where the case begins to become a little complicated. At the time of Brian's disappearance, portions of the South Campus Gateway complex were still undergoing construction. This fact quickly became one of the most discussed aspects of the investigation. Why? Because construction areas often contain alternative pathways, service corridors, restricted access points, temporary openings, routes not typically used by the public. Some investigators and observers have suggested that Brian may have exited through one of these areas. If that happened, it could potentially explain why no camera captured a clear image of him leaving. But while the possibility answers one question, it creates several others. Why would Brian take an unusual route? Was he trying to avoid the crowd? Did he know about the area? Was he meeting someone? Or was it simply a spontaneous decision? The problem is that no evidence has emerged that definitely answers any of those questions. And because of that, the construction area theory remains exactly what it has always been, a possibility, not a conclusion. As concern for Brian grew, search efforts expanded. Investigators examined the area surrounding the bar. They searched nearby streets, parking structures, construction zones, areas where someone who was injured or disoriented might reasonably end up. They followed tips from the public, they checked hospitals, shelters, they looked for evidence that Brian had been involved in an accident, and despite extensive efforts, nothing provided a definitive answer. No confirmed crime scene, no confirmed accident, no discovery that clearly explained his disappearance. Imagine being an investigator in that situation. You know a person is missing. You know where they were last seen. And yet every lead seems to end exactly where it begins. That's one reason this case has remained so frustrating for law enforcement. The timeline appears solvable, the evidence appears promising, and yet the outcome remains unknown. While search efforts continued, investigators began conducting interviews. Friends, witnesses, employees, individuals who had interacted with Brian that night. Among the most discussed witnesses were the two women seen speaking with him shortly before his disappearance. As we mentioned earlier, investigators identified and interviewed them, and based on publicly available information, they cooperated with law enforcement and were not publicly identified as suspects. This is important because internet discussions often drift towards speculation, and speculation can sometimes overshadow facts. The fact is that investigators did not publicly indicate those women were responsible for Brian's disappearance. Their significance comes from their place in the timeline. They happened to be present during the last confirmed sighting. Nothing more has ever been publicly established. Investigators also interviewed numerous other individuals connected to that evening. In total, more than 100 people would reportedly be interviewed during the investigation. Yet despite that effort, no witness emerged with information capable of solving the case. Now we come to one of the most discussed and often misunderstood aspects of this investigation: Brian's cell phone. As you would expect, investigators examined phone records as part of their efforts to determine what happened. In the months after Brian's disappearance, reports surfaced that family members received a surprising development. At one point, calls placed to Brian's phone reportedly appeared to ring rather than immediately going to voicemail. For a family searching desperately for answers, that moment created hope. Hope that Brian might still be alive. Hope that the phone had been turned on. Hope that investigators were able to receive a breakthrough. Unfortunately, the situation proved far less clear than many initially believed. Over the years, various reports have suggested that that event may have been the result of a network anomaly rather than evidence that Brian or his phone were active. And that's an important distinction, because in true crime, there is often a difference between a clue and an explanation. The ringing phone was certainly intriguing, but it never produced definitive answers. And nearly 2 decades later, it remains another unsolved piece of this puzzle. When adults disappear voluntarily, investigators often look for signs of preparation: bank withdrawals, credit card activity, travel purchases, employment records, something indicating the person continued living elsewhere. Investigators examined those possibilities in Brian's case. Publicly available information suggests they found no evidence clearly demonstrating continued activity after his disappearance. No established financial trail, no confirmed indication that Brian had built a new life elsewhere. Now that's not proof that the voluntary disappearance is impossible, but it does mean investigators lack evidence supporting that theory. By this point in the investigation, detectives had interviewed witnesses. reviewed surveillance footage, conducted searches, examined records, and followed tips. And still, the central question remained unanswered. What happened to Brian Shaffer? Cases like this capture public attention because they challenge our assumptions. We assume cameras provide answers. We assume crowded places produce witnesses. And we assume people leave trails. But Brian's disappearance reminds us that reality isn't always that cooperative. Sometimes evidence exists, and still it isn't enough. Sometimes investigators do everything right, and still don't find answers. And perhaps that's why this case continues to resonate nearly 20 years later. Not because people enjoy mysteries, but because this mystery feels solvable. It feels like the answer should exist, somewhere, hidden within a missing detail, a forgotten memory, a witness who never came forward, a piece of evidence that hasn't yet been connected. And maybe one day it will be. But for now, all investigators can do is evaluate the possibilities. And that's exactly what we're going to do next. Because while no theory fully explains what happened to Brian Shaffer, some fit the evidence better than others. And understanding those theories helps explain why this case remains unsolved. So, in this final chapter of today's episode, we're going to examine the major theories surrounding Brian's disappearance. Not as internet rumors, and not as speculation, but through the lens of the evidence. What supports each theory, what challenges it, and what questions remain unanswered. Because in a case like this, certainty is easy. Evidence is much harder. At this point, we've reached the part of the case where facts become less certain. The timeline ends, the evidence becomes thinner, and investigators are left trying to explain something they can't fully reconstruct. This is where theories enter the conversation. And it's also where it's important to be careful, because theories can help us understand possibilities, but they are not evidence. The goal isn't to decide what we want to believe. The goal is to evaluate what the available information supports. So let's look at the major theories surrounding Brian's disappearance. Not as internet speculation and not as rumors, but as investigators might approach them, one piece at a time. Let's focus on the accident theory. For many investigators, an accident is often one of the first possibilities considered in a missing adult case. Not because it's the most dramatic explanation, but because it's often the most common. Brian had been drinking. It was late. He was in a busy entertainment district. And if he left the bar area through a route that wasn't fully documented, it's possible he encountered some kind of accident afterward. Perhaps he became disoriented. Perhaps he entered an area that wasn't safe. Something happened that no one witnessed. At first glance, this explanation has some strengths. It doesn't require a conspiracy. It doesn't require someone planning a disappearance. It doesn't require another person becoming involved. Sometimes tragedies happen unexpectedly. The challenge is what investigators didn't find. No accident scene, no personal belongings, no evidence clearly indicating where such an accident might have occurred. The area was searched extensively. And while searches are never perfect, many people struggle with the idea that an accidental death could leave so little behind. That doesn't make the theory impossible, but it does make it difficult to prove. And in this case, proof is exactly what's missing. Our next theory is foul play. If you spend time reading discussions about Brian's disappearance, you'll quickly discover that many people believe foul play is the most likely explanation. And there are reasons why. For starters, there has never been verified activity that clearly demonstrates Brian survived beyond that night. No confirmed sightings, no established financial trail, no verified communications, and no evidence that he boarded a bus, caught a flight, or started over somewhere else. When viewing through the lens, foul play begins to feel plausible. Perhaps Brian left the area, perhaps he encountered someone, and perhaps an event occurred that was never witnessed or reported. But this theory faces a major obstacle: evidence. Investigators have never publicly identified a suspect. They have never publicly announced evidence proving a crime occurred. There is no known crime scene connected to Brian's disappearance. No arrest, no charges, no publicly identified person responsible. And while the absence of evidence doesn't mean foul play didn't occur, it does mean investigators have been unable to establish it. And that's an important distinction, because in true crime, it's easy to confuse possibility with proof, and the two are not the same thing. For our final theory, we're going to look at voluntary disappearance. This theory tends to divide people more than any other. Some dismiss it immediately. Others believe it's entirely possible. And the truth is that both reactions are understandable. Supporters of this theory often point to the death of Brian's mother, the pressures of medical school, the emotional weight of grief, that possibility that he may have wanted a fresh start. After all, adults can choose to disappear. It happens. Not often, but it does. The problem is, the voluntary disappearances usually leave traces, preparations, financial activity, travel records, communication, something. But in Brian's case, investigators did not publicly identify evidence suggesting he prepared for a new life. No known withdrawals, no established destination, no document plan. And perhaps, most importantly, no confirmed contact with those closest to him. That last point matters, because if Brian intentionally disappeared, he successfully remained hidden for nearly 20 years. Not impossible, but certainly unusual. And that's why many investigators remain cautious about embracing the theory. Possible? Yes. Supported by strong evidence? No. Now, there is one final possibility that often gets overlooked. The possibility that the answer doesn't fit neatly into an existing theory. Human beings naturally seek explanations. We like categories. We like conclusions. We like stories with clear endings. But reality doesn't always cooperate. It's entirely possible that something occurred that investigators never uncovered. A chance encounter. An unexpected decision. A circumstance no one documented. A factor no one considered. One of the challenges in any long-term unsolved case is recognizing how much information may be missing. Not hidden, not covered up, simply missing. And when crucial information is missing, even experienced investigators can struggle to see the full picture. And this may be exactly what happened here. It's been 20 years since Brian Shaffer disappeared. For some people, that's difficult to comprehend. There are college students today who weren't even born when this case began. Yet somehow, people continue to talk about it. Why? Partly because it's a mystery. But I don't think that's the whole reason. I think people continue returning to this case because it's a challenging assumption. We assume cameras capture everything. We assume crowded places generate witnesses. We assume technology leaves a trail. Brian's disappearance reminds us that certainty is often an illusion, even with cameras, even with records, even with investigators working tirelessly to find answers. Some questions remain unanswered, and that's uncomfortable, but it's also reality. Over the years, investigators have continued receiving tips. Age-progressed images have been released. The case has been featured in documentaries, articles, podcasts, and online discussions. And despite all that attention, the mystery remains. For Brian's family, this isn't simply an unsolved case. It's a missing son, a missing loved one, a missing piece of their lives. And that's something worth remembering whenever we discuss true crime. Behind every timeline is a real person, and behind every theory is a family still searching for answers. And behind every unsolved case is a question that never fully goes away. What happened? As I worked through the research for this episode, one thing became clear. The Brian Shaffer case is unusual, not because there are no theories. It's unusual because none of the theories fully explain the evidence. Each one answers some questions. Each one creates others. And perhaps that's why the case continues to fascinate investigators nearly 2 decades later. Some mysteries feel impossible. This isn't one of them. This feels solvable. It feels like the answer exists somewhere in a missing detail, a forgotten observation, a witness who never realized what they saw, or a piece of evidence that has yet to be connected. Maybe someday the answer will emerge. Maybe it won't. But until it does, Brian Shaffer remains one of the most perplexing missing persons cases in modern American history. Before we wrap things up, a quick thank you to everyone supporting Post Mortem on Patreon. This week's bonus episode is titled The Missing Minutes. In that episode, we'll take a deeper look at the surveillance footage, the construction area theory, the cell phone mystery, common misconceptions about the case, and why investigators remain divided on possible explanations. Patreon members will also have access to this week's timeline sheet, case summary, source list, and discussion poll. If you'd like to support the show and gain access to bonus content, our link is patreon.com/postmortemthepodcast, and you'll also find the link in the show notes. Thank you for listening to this episode of Post Mortem. If you enjoyed today's episode, consider following the show and leaving a rating or review wherever you listen to podcasts. It genuinely helps more people discover the show and supports future episodes. All sources used in today's episode can be found in the show notes. If you have information related to Brian Shaffer's disappearance, please contact the appropriate law enforcement agency. Do not attempt to contact witnesses, family members, or individuals connected to the case yourself. Thank you for spending part of your day with me, and thank you for joining me for the Season 2 premiere of Post Mortem. And until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and stay vigilant. Was being stored in his basement, and that his killing tools were acquired through mail order outfits. In 1991, the search warrant executed by VPD revealed Allen had, in his basement, handwritten diagrams for bombs comprised of ammonium nitrate, fertilizer, and gravel. Also found were mail order catalogs for bombs, guns, and booby traps. On August 28th of 1992, video have never been revealed. Join me back in part 3 as we discuss a few more of the suspects in this infamous case. And until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and stay vigilant.